Greater Kongji, the United Federation of China. At its pre-war height, this region boosted a population of over 35 million. Now, there's barely 50,000. Reconstruction funds have been slow to arrive in this part of the country, the government choosing to concentrate on the more densely populated coast. There's no central power grid, no running water besides the river, but the streets are clear of rubble, and the local security council has prevented any post-war outbreaks. The chairman of that council is Kwang Singsu, the medical doctor who, despite his advanced age and wartime injuries, still manages to make house calls to all of his patients. The first outbreak I saw was in a remote village that officially had no name. The residents call it Desheng, but that was more out of nostalgia than anything else. Their former home, Old Desheng, had stood since the period of the Three Kingdoms, with farms and houses, and even trees said to be centuries old. When the Three Gorges Dam was completed, and the reservoir waters began to rise, much of Desheng had to be disassembled brick by brick, and then rebuilt on high ground. This new Desheng, however, is not a town anymore, but a national historic museum. It must have been a heartbreaking irony for those poor peasants to see their town saved, but then only be able to visit it as a tourist. Maybe that's why some of them chose to name their newly constructed hamlet New Desheng, to preserve some connection to their heritage, even if it was only a name. I personally didn't know that this New Desheng had existed, so you can imagine how confused I was when the call came in. That night, the hospital was quiet. It had been a slow night, even for the increasing number of drunk driving accidents. Motorcycles had become very popular. We used to say that your Harley Davidsons killed more Chinese than all the GIs in the Korean War. That's why I was so grateful for a quiet shift. I was tired. My back and feet ached. I was on my way out to smoke a cigarette and watch the dawn when I heard my name being paged. The receptionist that night was new, and I couldn't quite understand the dialect. There had been an accident or an illness. It was an emergency. That part was obvious. And could we please send help at once? What could I say? The younger doctors, the kids who think medicine is just a way to pad their bank accounts, they certainly weren't going to help some Nogman just for the sake of helping. I guess I'm still just an old revolutionary at heart. Our duty is to hold ourselves responsible to the people. Those words still mean something to me. And I tried to remember that as my deer bounced and banged over the dirt roads the government had promised, but never quite gotten around to paving. I had a devil of a time finding the place. Officially, it didn't exist, and therefore, it wasn't on a map. I became lost several times and had to ask directions from locals who kept thinking I meant the museum town. I was in an impatient mood by the time I reached the small collection of hilltop homes. I remember thinking, this had better be damn serious. Once I saw their faces, I regretted that wish. There were 7 of them, all on cots, barely conscious. The villagers had moved them into a communal meeting hall. The walls and the floor, bare cement. The air, cold and damp. Of course they're sick, I thought. Ask the villagers who'd been taking care of these people. They said no one. It wasn't safe. I noticed that the door had been locked from the outside, and the villagers were clearly terrified. They cringed and whispered. Some kept their distance and prayed. Their behavior made me angry. Not at them. You gotta understand. Not individuals, but what it represented about our country. After centuries of foreign oppression, exploitation, humiliation, we're finally reclaiming our rightful place as humanity's middle kingdom. We were the world's richest and most dynamic superpower, masters of everything from outer space to cyberspace. It was the dawn of what the world was finally acknowledging as the Chinese century, and yet so many of us still lived in these ignorant peasants, as stagnant and superstitious as the earliest Yingzhou savages. I was still lost in my grand cultural criticism when I knelt to examine the first patient. She was running a high fever, like 40 degrees centigrade. She was shivering violently, barely coherent. She whimpered slightly when I tried to move her limbs. There was a wound on her right forearm. It kind of looked like a bite mark. When I examined it more closely, I realized that if it was a bite mark, it wasn't from an animal. The bite radius and teeth had to have come from a small, possibly young human being. Although I hypothesized this to be the source of the infection, the actual injury was surprisingly clean. I'd asked the villagers, again, who was taking care of these people? Again, I was told, no one. I knew this couldn't be true. The human mouth is packed with bacteria, even more than the most unhygienic dog. If no one had cleaned this woman's wound, why wasn't it throbbing with infection? I examined the 6 other patients. All showed similar symptoms. All had similar wounds on various parts of their bodies. I asked one man, the most lucid of the group, who or what had inflicted these injuries. He told me it had happened when he tried to subdue him. Him. Who? I asked. He pointed. I found this patient 0 behind the locked door of an abandoned house across the town. He was probably 12 years old, his wrists and feet bound with a plastic packing twine. Although he'd rubbed the skin off his bonds, there was no blood. There was also no blood on his other wounds, not in the gouges on his legs or in his arms, or from the large, dry gap where his right big toe had been. He was writhing like an animal. A gag muffled his growls. At first, the villagers tried to hold me back. They warned me not to touch him, that he was cursed. I shrugged them off and reached for my mask and gloves. The boy's skin was cold and gray as the cement on which he laid on. I couldn't find a heartbeat nor a pulse. His eyes were wild, wide, and sunken back into their sockets. It reminded me of what a predatory beast looks like. Throughout the examination, he was inexplicably hostile, reaching for me with his bound hands and snapping at me through his gag. His movements were so violent, I had to call for 2 of the largest villagers to help me hold him down. Initially, they wouldn't budge, cowering in the doorway like baby rabbits. I explained there's no way, there's no risk, none, of the infection if they used these gloves and masks. When they shook their heads, I made it sound like an order. I didn't have any lawful authority to do so, but that's all it took. The 2 oxen knelt beside me. One held the boy's feet, while the other grasped his hands. I tried to take a blood sample, and instead extracted brown, viscous matter. As I was withdrawing the needle, the boy began another bout of violent struggling. One of my orderlies, the one responsible for his arms, gave up trying to hold him and thought it might be safer if he just braced him against the floor with his knees. But the boy jerked again. I heard his left arm snap. Jagged ends of both the radius and ulna bone stabbed through his flesh. Although he didn't cry out, he didn't even really seem to notice. It was just enough for both assistants to leap back and take off. They ran from the room. I even retreated several paces myself. I'm embarrassed to admit this. I've been a doctor for most of my entire adult life. I was trained in, you could say, raised by the People's Liberation Army. I've treated more than my share of combat injuries, faced my own death on more than one occasion, and now I was scared, truly scared of this frail child. The boy began to twist in my direction. His arm ripped completely free. Flesh and muscle tore from one another until there was nothing except the stump. His now free right arm, still tied to the severed left hand, dragged his body across the floor. I hurried outside, locked the door behind myself. I tried to compose myself, control this fear and this shame. My voice, it was cracking as I asked the villagers what had happened to this boy. Had he been infected? No one dared answer. I began to hear banging on the door, the boy's fist pounding weakly against the thin wood. It was all I could do not to jump at the sound. I prayed they would not notice the door or the color draining from my face. I shouted as much as fear from frustration. I had to know what happened to this child. A young woman came forward, maybe his mother. You could tell she'd been crying for days. Her eyes were dry and deeply red. She admitted that it happened when the boy and his father were moonfishing, a term that describes diving for treasure amongst the sunken ruins of the Three Gorges Reservoir. With more than 1,100 abandoned villages, towns, and even cities, there was always hope of recovering something of value. It was a very common practice in those days. It was also very illegal. She explained they weren't looting. It was their old village, Old Desheng, and they had just been trying to recover some heirlooms from the remaining houses that had been moved. She repeated the point, and I had to interrupt her with promises not to inform the police. She finally explained that the boy came up crying with a bite mark on his foot. He didn't really know what had happened. The water had been too dark, too muddy. His father, though, never seen again. I reached for my cell phone and dialed the number for Dr. Gu Wen, an old comrade from my army days who now worked at the Institute for Infectious Diseases at Kwehong University. We exchanged pleasantries, discussed our health, our grandchildren. It was only proper. Then told him about the outbreak and listened as he made some joke about the hygiene habits of hillbillies. I tried to chuckle along, but continued that I thought the incident might be significant. Almost reluctantly, he asked me what the symptoms were. Told him everything. The bites, the fever, the boy, the arm. His face suddenly stiffened. His smile, dead. He asked me to show him the infected. I went back to the meeting hall and waved the phone's camera over each of the patients. He asked me to move the camera closer to some of the wounds themselves. I did so, and when I brought the screen back to my face, I saw that the video image had been cut. "Stay where you are," he said. "Take the names of all who have been in contact with the infected, restrain those already infected, and if any have passed into a coma, vacate the room and secure the exit." His voice was flat, robotic, as if he had rehearsed the speech or was reading from something. He asked me, "Are you armed?" "Why would I be?" I asked. He told me he would get back to me, all business again. He said he had to make a few calls and that I should expect support within several hours. They were there in less than 50 men in a large Z-8 type helicopters, and they were all wearing hazmat suits. They all said they were from the Ministry of Health. I don't know who they thought they were kidding. With their bullying swagger, their intimidating arrogance, and even those backwater bumpkins could recognize the Gobanu. Their first priority was the meeting hall. The patients were carried out on stretchers, their limbs shackled, their mouths gagged. Next, they went for the boy, and he came out in a body bag. His mother was wailing, and she had said that the rest of the villages were rounded up for exterminations. Their names were taken, their blood drawn one by one. They were stripped and photographed. The last one had to be exposed as a withered old woman. She had this thin, crooked body and a face with 1,000 lines and tiny feet. She had to have had them bound when she was a girl. She was shaking her bony fist at the doctors. "This is your punishment," she shouted. "This is revenge for the Fengdu." She was referring to the city of ghosts whose temples and shrines were dedicated to the underworld. Like Old Desheng, they had been an unlucky obstacle to China's next great leap forward. It had been evacuated, then demolished, and then almost entirely drowned. I'd never been a superstitious person, and I never even allowed myself to be hooked on the opiate of the people. I'm a doctor. I'm a scientist. I believe in only what I can see and what I can touch. I've never seen Fengdu as anything but a cheap, kitschy tourist trap. Of course, the ancient crone's words had no effect on me, but her tone, her anger, she'd witnessed enough